for this opportunity. Ovarian stimulation in ART is definitely a very big topic. So what I have tried to incorporate in my presentation today are just some of the recent guidelines. The main focus of my talk will be on the recent guidelines from ESHRE 2019, but I've also tried to incorporate the latest guidelines and the meta-analysis from Cochrane as well. So before I start, I would like to confess that, this is just a general overview about the ovarian stimulation in ART. I have not focused specifically on hyper responders or normal responders or poor responders, because if we start talking about ovarian stimulation, it can go on for days and days. So this is just a small, concise update on the guidelines that have come out over the last 2 or 3 years. So to introduce my talk, the development of IVF as a tool for treating infertility for tubal disease, severe male factor causes, anovulation, and even conditions like unexplained
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt and disturb you. We need that full screen
full
mode
screen. Oh,
presentation.
sure. Is it fine?
Yes, now this is
You
fine.
can, yeah.
Thank you.
So the development of IVF has definitely brought an enormous potential to the infertility treatment armamentarium. So of all the couples who visit the infertility center, roughly around 35 to 40% will not achieve the so desired goal. We still have areas of low level knowledge on the key factors of success in ART, such as the gamete quality, the embryo quality, the endometrial receptivity. Now, very soon after the development of IVF technology, as you all know, the initial IVF was performed in a natural menstrual cycle, and this was superseded by the ovarian stimulation. So this was mainly aimed at solving two problems. One, to eliminate the risk of having no oocyte at all. And two, was to urge to improve the efficiency by obtaining several embryos so that, we can transfer the best top quality embryos to the patient to help her achieve the probability of pregnancy. Now, ovarian stimulation has definitely been one of the cornerstones of IVF treatment, next to the in vitro handling of gametes and embryos and the embryo replacement process. But the relative contribution to the overall success of IVF by overall stimulation phase is still difficult to assess, because the success of ART depends on so many factors, but definitely ovarian stimulation plays an important role in it. Now, like I mentioned earlier, multiple embryos can be transferred in most women. If they have excess embryos, these can be cryopreserved for future chances of pregnancy without the need for repeated ovarian stimulation and oocyte retrieval. To achieve this, the FSH and the LH concentrations must be kept above a critical threshold. Now, the basis of ovarian stimulation is the administration of the exogenous gonadotrophins, the FSH and LH, with or without prior treatment with oral hormone therapy. Now, GnRH agonist and antagonist given concurrently with FSH to prevent a premature rise of the endogenous LH that would induce a rise in the progesterone or cause an ovulation to occur earlier on. An oocyte maturation trigger is required, and a GnRH agonist may be administered using a standard, a flare, or an ultra long protocol depending on the patient characteristics. So Sankara et al. In 2014 has defined an excessive response to stimulation as the retrieval of more than 15 oocytes, and it has also been shown that the clinical pregnancy rates plateau or decline with retrievals above this benchmark. Now, the final maturation trigger is either by HCG or GnRH agonist or even both. And after ovarian stimulation, we have various phases of luteal phase supplementation. So this is what an overview of ovarian stimulation is. And there are so many stimulation regimens. We have the natural cycles, we have the mild stimulation, we have the minimal stimulation, and we have the use of the agonist and the antagonists. Now, each of these approaches have their own advantages and disadvantages. So since the early 1980s, GnRH agonists have been used for preventing a premature LH surge. Now, the new entry in the 1990s were the GnRH antagonists. So different regimens for the use of GnRH antagonists have been available, and I've just put it all into a box form. So you have the single 3 mg depot, which is no longer available. You have the multiple doses of 0.25 milligrams, which is still used. And you have different regimens, the fixed regimen and the flexible regimen. Fixed regimen is starting an antagonist on day 6, and a flexible regimen is when the leading follicle is more than 14 millimeter. Now, how do you classify a response to an ovarian stimulation? It is usually, as in previously, it was classified as poor, normal, or excessive. Now, this could be stigmatizing and traumatizing for the patients, and hence the decision to move the terminology to low, normal, and a high response has come into play. Now, a high ovarian response is defined as an exaggerated response to the conventional ovarian stimulation with a dose of around 150 to 225 international units of FSH, which is definitely characterized by the presence of more follicles and more oocytes than what is intended. Now, this was this was from an article published by George Grisinger in 2016. Now, generally, more than 18 follicles of more than 11 millimeter on the day of oocyte maturation trigger, and if you collect more than 18 oocytes, definitely characterizes a high response, and this it correlates with an increased risk of ovarian hyperstimulation. A low response is defined by a diminished response to the conventional ovarian stimulation, where you have a low number of follicles or oocytes. If you get more than, if you get less than 3 follicles on the day of oocyte maturation, or oocyte maturation trigger, or less than 3 oocytes obtained after ovum pickup, characterizes a lower response. Now, a little bit about the markers of ovarian response. There have been so many articles published on this. So before I come into the original guidelines from ESHRE, I would just like to briefly mention something about the newer markers of ovarian response. So hyperresponsiveness, like I mentioned, is characterized by a low follicle output rate, which shows that there is a discrepancy between the number of pre-ovulatory follicles which develops following the ovarian stimulation compared to the number of antral follicles which were present at the start of stimulation. So the pathological mechanisms for this is definitely not understood. It could be a genotype-based mechanism. There has also been evidence associating the gonadotropins and the FSH receptor polymorphisms and the ovarian hyperresponse. And environmental contaminants and oxidative stress may also play a large role. Now, one of the newer markers has been the follicle to oocyte index. Now, this was published by Alvigi et al. In 2018. So before I go on to this is something that everyone knows, the follicle output rate, which is the ratio between the number of pre-ovulatory follicles obtained in response to ovarian stimulation with FSH administration and the pre-existing pool of the antral follicles. So if you have a follicle output rate of less than 30, it indicates a hyperresponse. But the disadvantage of this follicle output rate is that it is not associated with any of the ovarian markers. So a lady who has an adequate ovarian marker will still have a low follicle output rate. So you cannot assess the actual number of oocytes retrieved based on the follicle output rate. So if you have around 30% or less than 30%, it shows a hyposensitivity to FSH, and 80% is an adequate response. Then came the ovarian sensitivity index, which was an index which measures the total administered dose of FSH and the number of oocytes retrieved. So if you have a high ovarian sensitivity index, it reflects a ovarian resistance to the ovarian stimulation, which suggests a hyperresponse. But this assessment does not involve any particular type or the regimen of gonadotropin used, but these were associated with the AMH level. So this is a less robust index which is not used much. So the newest one is the follicle to oocyte index, which is the ratio of the total number of oocytes which is collected at the start of ovarian stimulation and the number of antral follicles which are available at the start of stimulation. It can be used alone. It can also be used with the FORT. This index can definitely be used to predict the likelihood of success in ART. So if you have a low follicle to oocyte index, it indicates that only a fraction of the antral follicles present in the ovary was used during the stimulation. So if she does not conceive in that cycle, there might be different and a wide variety of therapeutic opportunities for the physician to explore in subsequent stimulation cycles. So then if you have a follicle to oocyte index more than 50, that is considered normal. And if it is less than 50, it is considered to be low. So reasons for low follicle oocyte index could be a lower dose of gonadotropins, genetic environmental factors, asynchronous follicular development, and technical issues involved during the trigger that is given and even on the day of the ovum pickup. So coming on to the ESHRE guidelines, which was published in 2019 by the Guideline Development Group. How do you assess what is the stimulation that you have to give the lady? What is the dosage that you have to give? And what would work best for her? So for predicting a high and a poor response to ovarian stimulation, the use of either an antral follicle count or an anti-Mullerian hormone is recommended, and the strength of evidence is strong. So there have been larger meta-analysis by Jayaprakashan and Anderson, which shows that AMH and AFC are reliable indicators of the reproductive age and are the best predictors to both poor response and excessive response. So previously we used to use a wide variety of things like FSH, inhibin, and so on. So right now we have two important indicators. One is the AMH and second is the AFC. So again, the other ovarian reserve tests are not clinically useful for either guiding the dose or even for improving the fertility outcome. And the evidence is from meta-analysis that has been conducted in 2013, systematic reviews, and RCTs. So now, how do you determine what is the dose of the gonadotrophin that you require? So previously, we've used markers like FSH, estradiol, inhibin, and then the antral follicle count, AMH. All those have been used for predicting the ovarian response and for selecting the FSH dose. So again, I would like to stress again and again that AFC and AMH have the highest accuracy for predicting the poor and the excessive response. So how do you know whether the patient has a poor response or an excessive response with the AFC and the AMH? An AFC less than 7 and an AMH of less than 1.1 indicates a poor response. If you have an AFC of more than 14 and an AMH of more than 3.5, it indicates a hyper response. The recommended dosages for normal responders is around 150 to 225 international units, and for poor responders, predicted poor responders is 225 to 300 international units. In expected hyper responders, a lower FSH dose should be used as they reduce the risk of OHSS without compromising the success rates. So this has again been proved in studies like the Optimus study, which showed that predicted hyper responders who got a dose of around 150 international units, daily dose of FSH, compared to 100 international units, had a significantly higher number of oocytes retrieved and was associated with a lower first cycle cancellation rate. If you give a higher daily dosage, this was associated with a higher risk of mild to moderate OHSS, around 11%. Now, combined oral contraceptive pills have been used by all the ART clinicians because it helps in so many things. It helps in preparing a batch. It helps in timing a lot of things. But then the evidence now says that COC pre-treatment is not recommended in a GnRH antagonist protocol because of reduced efficacy. There has been evidence of lower live birth rate and ongoing pregnancy rate using up to 12 to 28 days of combined oral contraceptive pills in GnRH antagonist protocols. Even though the evidence for poor responders is less clear, the guideline development groups recommends against using COCs again in GnRH antagonist protocols in poor responders. GnRH antagonist pre-treatment before ovarian stimulation in a delayed start gonadotropin protocol is also not recommended. So these are just the recommendations from ESHRE. If you read about different other bodies and different studies, there have been a lot of conflicting evidences. Now, assessment of progesterone on day 2 of the cycle at the start of ovarian stimulation is no longer recommended. Pre-treatment with estrogen before ovarian stimulation in GnRH antagonist protocols has not been recommended. Pre-treatment with progesterone before ovarian stimulation also has not been recommended for improving efficacy and safety, because all this has been shown to have no particular benefit in improving the live birth rate. Now, this was again a narrative from the World Health Organization. They also agree with the fact that combined oral contraceptive pills in GnRH agonist cycles did not have much of a difference in the clinical pregnancy rates. If you give an oral contraceptive in an antagonist cycle, it was associated with fewer ongoing pregnancies. So that is why an oral contraceptive pill has been taken away in GnRH antagonist cycles. So these were also associated with more treatment days and higher amount of gonadotropin therapy. But somehow, compared with placebo and no pretreatment, progesterone treatment in GnRH agonist protocols seems to improve the chance of clinical pregnancy. This is again why I mentioned there is conflicting evidence. So again, I have a meta-analysis and systematic reviews from Cochrane by Farquhar in 2017. The role of oral contraceptive pills, progesterone and estrogen pretreatment for ovarian stimulation protocols in women undergoing ART. So the Cochrane stresses that COC pretreatment in antagonist protocols was associated with a lower rate of live birth and ongoing pregnancy. There is insufficient evidence to determine whether the rates of live birth or ongoing pregnancies were influenced by pretreatment with progesterones or estrogens. So the take-home message from this is that COC pretreatment in antagonist cycles is no longer recommended. So this was another PhD summary by Christopher Blockhill in 2012. So why has been there so much of hue and cry about the oral contraceptive pills usage? The gestagen component of OC pills has been shown to negatively impact the endometrial receptivity. Also, use of OC pills for more than 12 days, 12 to 28 days, may affect the LH levels. Low LH levels at the starting of a cycle will impair the oocyte competence and the endometrial receptivity when it is performed, when the stimulation is performed with recombinant FSH without LH in GnRH antagonist cycles. So as we all know, GnRH antagonist is the protocol recommended for PCOS women, and this is based on strong evidence. GnRH antagonist protocol is as efficient as the GnRH agonist protocol and significantly reduces the risk of OHSs in PCOS women. In 2005 and 2007, there were a lot of Cochrane reviews which stated that GnRH antagonist protocols were associated with a decrease in the live birth. But in 2015, Cochrane again came out with a systematic review which indicated that GnRH antagonist protocol is as efficient as the agonist protocol. So it is associated with a similar live birth rate, a lower incidence of OHSS, and the reduced risk of OHSS in a GnRH antagonist cycle is possibly related to the use of a GnRH agonist trigger. A lower ovum pickup rate was observed after antagonist treatment in overall population, but not in women with PCOS or women with poor ovarian reserve. So GnRH antagonist protocol can be proposed for patients with an expected normal or a high response, and there is no sufficient data for GnRH antagonist protocol in a poor responder. So how do you fine tune the antagonist cycle? You can do a pre-treatment with estrogen from day 25 or norethistron from day 20 to prevent a follicular dominance. Antagonist is initiated on a fixed day, day 6 of stimulation. There is no benefit in increasing the dose of FSH and LH from the day of antagonist. The time interval between the antagonist and the HCG should not be more than 30 hours, and the time interval between each antagonist should not be more than 30 hours. Now, in predicted high responders, what do? Is there a role in adding clomiphene citrate to gonadotropins? No, there has been no improvement in the outcome. There is no specific evidence on the expected non-PCOS high responders or PCO or morphology patients. The consensus of the guideline group is that if it's a non-PCOS hyper responder or a patient with a PCO morphology, GnRH antagonist protocol is recommended. So again and again, I'm stressing, and it's a universally accepted thing, that GnRH antagonist protocol is recommended in predicted high responders, and there is no role in adding clomiphene citrate to gonadotropins in these stimulation protocols. So if a GnRH agonist protocol is used, a reduced gonadotropin dose is probably recommended to reduce the risk of OHSS. So the evidence shows that if you have a lower dose of gonadotropins, it may increase the safety in a GnRH agonist protocol. So in a high responder, is there any evidence of using a natural cycle or a modified natural cycle? There is no evidence to justify its use. In a normal responder, Again, there is strong evidence that you can use a GnRH antagonist protocol. And owing to comparable live birth rate between the antagonist and the agonist protocol and the significant decrease in OHSS, GnRH antagonist protocol is recommended in a normal responder. So now this was again a research article by Wang et al. In PLOS ONE on the comparisons of the antagonist and the agonist long protocol in patients with a normal ovarian reserve. So Wang et al. Showed that there were lower stimulation days, lower gonadotrophin dosages, lower E2 level on the day of HCG, but a lower number of oocytes and embryos with antagonist. But there was no difference in the clinical pregnancy rate, ongoing pregnancy rate, and the live birth rate between the agonist and the antagonist. So I think that is something we all have to stress upon. So again, GnRH antagonist protocol has been recommended in normal responder. Adding letrozole to gonadotrophins in normal responders is probably not recommended. In a normal responder, starting with a reduced gonadotrophin dose is also not recommended, and no role in adding clomiphene citrate to the stimulation protocols. So coming to poor responders. So GnRH antagonists and agonists have been recommended equally for predicted poor responders. Clomiphene citrate alone or in combination with gonadotrophins and gonadotrophin stimulation alone is equally recommended for poor responders. Adding letrozole to gonadotrophins in poor responders is not recommended. So is there a role in increasing, starting at a dose of more than 150? I know many of you would not agree with me for recommending a dose of 150 for a poor responder, but this is something that that made me ponder also, you know, a dose of 150 for a poor responder, would it help the patient? But the guideline group says that there is unclear evidence as to whether a higher dose can be recommended. But a dose of more than 300 international units is definitely not recommended for a poor responder, and this is based on strong evidence. Using a modified natural cycle again is not recommended over the conventional ovarian stimulation, and no studies were found comparing a reduced dose, that is a dose of less than 150. So I think safer would be a dose of between 150 to 300 for a poor responder. But then again, we have to think whether 150 would be an ideal dose if you're doing a conventional stimulation. If a GnRH agonist is used, then you should be using a long GnRH agonist protocol. Using progesterones for LH peak suppression is probably not recommended. And if it is used, it can be used in the context of non-transfer cycles only. So what is the drug of choice for stimulation? Using recombinant FSH and HMG for ovarian stimulation is equally recommended. You can use a recombinant FSH or a purified FSH in a GnRH agonist protocol. You can use a highly purified FSH and HMG in agonist protocols. Using a recombinant LH for ovarian stimulation is probably not recommended over HMG in GnRH agonist protocols with regards to safety. Letrozole is not a substitute for gonadotrophins in poor responders. Use of long-acting and daily acting recombinant FSH has been equally recommended in GnRH antagonist cycles, but we do not have corifoliotropin alpha available right now. So I guess we have to still go with the recombinant FSH. And there is no evidence available to recommend the substitution of FSH by clomiphene citrate in ovarian stimulation. Now, adjustment of the gonadotrophin dose in mid-stimulation phase during ovarian stimulation is not recommended. So is there a role in adding LH to FSH? Using recombinant FSH plus recombinant LH was associated with an increased chances of live birth when compared to recombinant FSH alone. But there was no difference in the ongoing pregnancy rates between the two groups. And there was also no evidence of a difference between women identified as poor responders who were treated with an antagonist protocol compared to a long agonist protocol in terms of live birth and ongoing pregnancy. So if you're using FSH alone, LH has a role. Then again, we are coming to some of the newer trials that have come out. On the basis of inconsistent evidence, there is no recommendation for FSH plus recombinant LH in poor responders except in the context of an RCT. And adding growth hormone in managing poor responders again shows inconclusive findings. So is there a role in individualizing the FSH dose based on the AMH levels? So this was an article that came in the Human Reproduction in 2018 that, you know, do we, on the basis of an FSH dosing algorithm, comparing it to the AMH levels in women, is there a role? So the summary answer was that the AMH based algorithm did not increase the proportion of patients with the intended oocyte retrieval. So here the AMH was measured in picomoles, and the women who had a higher AMH of more than 24 had around 100 international units per day of recombinant FSH. Those who had an AMH of between 12 to 24 had around 150 international units per day of recombinant FSH. And those women who had less than 12 picomoles had around 100 to 150 micrograms of corifoliotropin used, depending on the body weight. But however, this failed to show any benefit that adjusting the dosage of FSH based on the AMH values did not increase the proportion of the oocytes in that particular patient. So MERIT trial is something everyone is aware about. It was conducted in 2006 by Anderson et al. This was a group of the Ferring RCTs, and this compared Menopur at a dose of 225 to 450 international units per day with recombinant FSH. And the primary endpoint was the ongoing pregnancy rate following one IVF cycle. And all the patients received a long protocol, a GnRH agonist long protocol. So the primary endpoint was that those women who were stimulated with Menopur had a 27% ongoing pregnancy rate compared to those women who were stimulated with recombinant FSH. The latest one is the MEGACET-HR trial. So this was published in 2020 in Fertility Sterility. It was a randomized assessor-blinded trial which compared the highly purified human menotropin and recombinant FSH in high responders undergoing ICSI. So what did the MEGACET-HR trial show? So here the trials compared the clinical live birth rate per transfer, the number of transfers, and the number of embryos transferred. So here, those in blue is what is the stimulation given by HMG, and the black is the recombinant FSH. So there was a clinical live birth rate of 50.6 in women who were stimulated with HMG compared to 51.5 in those women who were stimulated with RFSH. The number of transfers, 291 transfers were done in the HP-HMG group compared to 334 in the recombinant FSH. And again, 65 less embryos were transferred in those women who were stimulated by the HP-HMG. So this is actually not a superiority trial. This is a non-inferiority trial. And one important thing that I would like to mention is that these all were in FET cycles. And secondly, the superiority of HP-HMG is only by Ferring. This is a trial that is conducted by Ferring, and they have used Menopur. So they were able to show that Menopur is superior to Gonal-f. But whether we can extrapolate this data to all the HMGs that we are using is something that we still have to ponder about, and maybe conduct a larger study to find out whether actually this is something that can be applied to all the HMGs that we are using in our daily practice and not just Menopur. So again, the European and the Israel study group, the MERIT trial, MEGACET trials, and the MEGACET-HR trials have all shown a benefit of using HP-HMG, which is Menopur, compared to recombinant FSH, and all these are RCTs by Ferring. So again, coming to a little bit about polycystic ovarian syndrome, some of the summaries and recommendations from the evidence-based guideline. So IVF has been recommended as the third line therapy. Urinary or recombinant FSH can be used in women with PCOS. Using an exogenous recombinant LH should not be done routinely. A GnRH antagonist protocol is preferred. If you use a GnRH antagonist protocol, you can trigger with a GnRH agonist and freeze all the embryos, thus reducing the risk of OHSS. Now, we have a large number of adjuvants available for ovarian stimulation. We have things like DHEA, we have things like metformin, we have growth hormone, we have so many things to use, but is there a benefit in using any one of these? So the routine use of metformin before or during ovarian stimulation is not recommended in PCO women who are undergoing the stimulation with an antagonist protocol. Using growth hormone before or during ovarian stimulation is not recommended in poor responders. Testosterone also does not have a role so far in poor responders. and DHEA is also probably not recommended. So what about aspirin? The use of aspirin again is not recommended. This is based on strong evidence. Sildenafil again is not recommended. And there is no evidence about the safety of using indomethacin in ovarian stimulation. So DHEA, there was a large trial conducted, the DITO trial. The DITO trial was a double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. It came out in 2017, I think. It was published in the European Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So what did the DITO trial show? The pre-treatment with DHEA supplementation did not improve the response to ovarian hyperstimulation or oocyte quality or live birth rate in women who were predicted to have a poor ovarian response. So here, these women received DHEA at a dose of 75 milligrams per day for at least 12 weeks. And the protocol was an HMG protocol with 300 international units, but this failed to show any benefit in using DHEA. So another trial that is still ongoing for the use of testosterone is the TRANSPORT trial. The TRANSPORT trial is by Polissos et al. And the results are still awaited. So this trial uses around 5.5 milligrams of, milligrams of testosterone. And this has to be used for at least 3 months prior to the ovarian stimulation. Whether it improves the live birth rate, again, we still have to find out. So what about the role of glucocorticoids? The safety and effectiveness of glucocorticoid administration is unclear because of the small number of studies. So what about the non-conventional ovarian stimulation? A random start ovarian stimulation has not been recommended in a general IV ICSI population. Late luteal phase start of gonadotrophins, not recommended in poor responders. Early luteal phase start gonadotrophins, not recommended in normal and poor responders. So only in the context of non-transfer cycles, a luteal phase stimulation could be beneficial. Now, double stimulation in poor responders, only in the context of clinical research, though there have been a lot of papers and articles which say otherwise. And double stimulation, however, can be considered for urgent fertility preservation cycles. So the dual stimulation was published in Fertility Sterility in June 2016 by Ubaldi et al. So what does this dual stimulation do? So you have a pre-treatment with a luteal estradiol priming on day 21 of the previous cycle. So it is given at a dose of 4 milligram per day and it is continued. And then a TVS and a basal assessment is done on day 2, day 3, and this estradiol is stopped. A follicular phase stimulation is done with recombinant FSH at a dose of 300 international units plus recombinant LH at 150 international units for 4 days. The follicular growth is monitored on day 5 and then every 2 to 3 days. A flexible GnRH antag is given when the nominal follicles is around 13 to 14 millimeter in both the follicular phase stimulation and the luteal phase stimulation. The trigger is given with buserelin 0.5 ml and the retrieval is done 35 hours later. The luteal phase stimulation is started 5 days after the first retrieval. So this is a schematic representation of what I just said now. So again, if you see in this bar chart, you can see that in the follicular phase stimulation, there were 41.9% patients who had no euploid, there were 41.9% patients who had more than one euploid blastocyst. But when it came to luteal phase stimulation, you see around 53.5% of the patients had more than one euploid blastocyst, and the cumulative euploid blastocyst was around 69.8%. Now, what about the mild stimulation versus standard stimulation? Mild ovarian stimulation may definitely have some advantages, reduces the multiple pregnancy risk, reduces the risk of OHSS, reduces definitely the physical and the emotional stress. So in a GnRH antagonist protocol, you're using a low dose of FSH or HMG up to around 150 international units per day, maximum dose of 150 international units per day. But there has been no difference in the live birth rate, and the ongoing pregnancy rates were lower in the mild stimulation group. So the only advantage is that there has been a reduce in the dose of gonadotrophins, but this correlates with the reduced number of oocytes retrieved, which may be, which will not be enough, we will not have surplus embryos for cryopreservation. What about the natural cycles and the modified natural cycles? So natural cycle IVF refers to the oocyte retrieval from the dominant follicle during a woman's spontaneous menstrual cycle. So to optimize the timing of the ovulation, the ART clinicians incorporated the use of the HCG trigger, because of which it was no longer purely natural. So the GnRH antagonist, from the time it was available, has also been applied to the unstimulated IVF cycles to further decrease the risk of premature ovulation. So because these antagonists not only stops the LH surge, but also disrupts the FSH stimulation of the growing follicle, some form of add back was required in the form of HMG or FSH. So these cycles, which utilizes the antagonist and a gonadotrophin add back, became known as the modified natural cycle IVF. So what is the advantage of doing the modified natural cycle IVF? So the obvious one is that it prevents the premature rise of progesterone. It avoids the endometrial embryo dyssynchrony and also the negative pregnancy outcomes. Most of the modified natural cycles IVF have eventually only one embryo available for transfer. And also there is an age-related decline in fertility. So the main important the factor behind the use of modified natural cycle IVF is that the progesterone levels are less. There is the premature rise in progesterone has been prevented. So what are the outcomes in poor responders who have been treated with a modified natural cycle IVF? So a higher dose of gonadotrophins use may recruit poor quality oocytes, which may not have been otherwise selected in a natural cycle. And older patients tend to receive higher doses of stimulation, and premature luteinization of the endometrium is seen with aggressive stimulation. So then who are the women who would benefit from doing a modified natural cycle IVF? Younger, good prognosis women. It could be a second line option for poor responders who have a suboptimal response, couples with religious or ethical preferences or who do not want to go in for any cryopreservation, and women who are anovulatory or oligoovulatory should not be considered for a modified natural cycle IVF. Now, the use of low dose HCG has again been recommended by Blockheal ever since 2012. And recent studies have demonstrated the use of low dose HCG for completing the follicular maturation in stimulated cycles. A Cochrane review has compared the use of low dose HCG and FSH in the late follicular phase. Cochrane concluded that its use does not reduce the chance of clinical pregnancy, and it is likely to result in an equivalent number. So what is the dose of HCG that you can use? You can use a dose of around 200 international units, but getting such a low dose is going to be different because we have ampules with a much higher dose. So the benefit of using low dose HCG in the place of HMG in the follicular phase is basically to reduce the cost. So what about the drugs for fertility preservation? For ovarian stimulation in women seeking fertility preservation, GnRH antagonist protocol is recommended. Only for urgent fertility preservation cycles, for example, in oncology, a random start ovarian stimulation is an option. The concomitant use of anti-estrogen therapy such as letrozole or tamoxifen can be considered. Now coming to monitoring the hormone levels. So there is, as per the guideline, there is no need for routine monitoring of the endometrial thickness during ovarian stimulation. So how do you assess the endometrial thickness? How do you take a decision for whether the trigger has to be given? So the association of a follicular size as a criteria for giving the trigger has not been sufficiently studied. So it can be decided on a case-to-case basis. There are a lot of factors, that the size of the follicles, the hormonal data, the duration of the stimulation, the financial cost to the patient, etc., all has to be taken into consideration. So the guideline development group recommends when the final oocyte maturation trigger when the leading follicles are between 16 and 22 millimeter. The base timing of final oocyte maturation trigger on basis of the estradiol levels alone has not been recommended, and no recommendation to base timing of the final oocyte maturation on the estradiol follicle ratio alone. Now, there is strong evidence by this group to stress upon the fact that a poor response to ovarian stimulation is not a reason to cancel a cycle. The couple should be counseled regarding the pregnancy prospects, and decide individually whether to continue this or further cycles. In GnRH agonist cycles with an ovarian response of more than 18 follicles, there is an increased risk of OHSS. Preventive measures are recommended, which could include cycle cancellation, and this is based on strong evidence. What about the triggers used? The use of recombinant HCG and urinary HCG are equally recommended, and this is based on strong evidence. A reduced dose of 5,000 international units of HCG for final oocyte maturation is probably recommended over 10,000 international units in GnRH agonist protocols, as it may improve the safety. Using a recombinant LH to trigger the oocyte maturation is not recommended, and this is again strong evidence. So in a general IVF ICSI population, routinely using a GnRH agonist for final oocyte maturation is not recommended. In a predicted normal responder, again, routinely using GnRH agonist is not recommended. If a GnRH agonist has to be used, doses ranging from 0.1 to 0.4 milligrams of triptorelin can be given, and adding a GnRH agonist to HCG as a dual trigger for final oocyte maturation is again not recommended for predicted normal responders. So can we compare HCG to GnRH agonist? There have been no studies investigating the direct comparison of HCG with different doses of GnRH agonist trigger. No RCTs could be found controlling the different dosages of buserelin and leuprolide, and hence no definite recommendation can be made. But there again have been papers showing suboptimal response following a GnRH trigger. So how do you know whether you are going to get a suboptimal oocyte yield following a GnRH agonist trigger? So this is by measuring the serum LH levels at the start of the ovarian stimulation. So those patients who had an immeasurable LH level, that is an LH of less than 0.1 international units at the start of stimulation, had almost a 50% risk of suboptimal response. But once the LH levels were on the higher side, that is LH levels were around less than 2 and less than 5, this decreased the risk. Now, progesterone again has been recommended for luteal phase support, and any form of progesterone that is non-oral for luteal phase support, progesterone can be used. So the different regimens are 50 milligrams once daily of intramuscular progesterone. If it's a subcutaneous method of administration, 25 milligrams per day, the aqueous-based ones. Vaginal progesterone at 90 milligrams. If it's a micronized vaginal progesterone at a dose of 200 milligrams 3 times a day. And again, in starch suppositories, you can use it at a dose of 100 milligrams 2 or 3 times a day. If it's a vaginal pessary, for 400 milligrams twice a day. Now again, what is the optimal time to start progesterone? Starting progesterone for luteal phase support should be in the window between the evening of the day of oocyte retrieval and day 3 post ovum pickup. Progesterone for luteal phase support should be administered at least till the day of pregnancy test. Now this protocol varies from center to center. There are centers which use it till at least 6 weeks, 7 weeks. There are centers using it till 12 weeks, but the recommendation is to at least give it until the day of the beta HCG or urine pregnancy test, whichever protocol your center follows. Now coming to the last few slides, how do we prevent OHSS? Does coasting help? What is coasting? Withholding gonadotrophins during the late follicular phase until the E2 levels drop sufficiently to permit a safe administration of HCG. Now coasting was assessed in Cochrane systematic reviews in 4 RCTs. Now, there has been low quality evidence to suggest that coasting reduces the moderate to severe OHSS compared to no coasting. There was no evidence to suggest that coasting was much more beneficial than other interventions. Now, the other interventions are dopamine agonists like cabergoline, quinaglide, and bromocriptine, elective cryopreservation of embryos, and subsequent transfer in a non-gonadotropin stimulated cycles. Then we have administration of intravenous volume expanders like human albumin, hydroxyethyl starch, giving metformin to decrease hyperinsulinemia, which reduces the production of the VEGF, are all important factors in the pathophysiology of OHSS. So coming to dopamine agonists were assessed in a Cochrane review. This was around 16 RCTs on the use of cabergoline, quinaglide, and bromocriptine. There was a beneficial effect on the use of dopamine agonist on the overall incidence of moderate to severe OHSS, and there was no evidence of an effect on the live birth rate or the clinical pregnancy rate. Embryo cryopreservation, again, no evidence of a difference in the rate of moderate to severe OHSS when cryopreservation of all the embryos were compared with intravenous albumin infusion or with fresh embryo transfer, and no evidence of an effect on the rate of live birth or clinical pregnancy when the embryos were cryopreserved. Now, these are all reviews. This does not mean that you should stop practicing what works for you and switch on to this. Now, what about plasma expanders? We have hydroxyethyl starch and albumin being administered after OM pickup in high responders. So intravenous plasma expanders were assessed in an updated Cochrane review. There is low quality evidence to suggest that intravenous albumin administration may reduce the incidence of moderate to severe OHSS. Albumin infusion was, however, associated with lower pregnancy rates. Now, there was low quality evidence to show that hydroxyethyl starch reduces the incidence of OHSS. Administration of mannitol may reduce the incidence, but only one RCT has evaluated this intervention. Hydroxyethyl starch or mannitol did not have an effect on the pregnancy rates. Now, metformin. Metformin was compared with placebo or no treatment in a Cochrane review. So metformin, adjunct metformin was able to reduce the incidence of OHSS, but there was an increased risk of side effects, the gastrointestinal disturbances. The dosage was around 500 milligrams twice daily to 850 milligrams 3 times a day. Now, again, let me stress again that in women at the risk of OHSS, a GnRH agonist trigger is recommended. To eliminate the risk of late onset OHSS, a freeze-all strategy is recommended, and this can be applicable in both GnRH agonist and antagonist protocols. If a GnRH agonist trigger with a freeze-all strategy is not used in patients at a risk of OHSS, it is not clear as to whether the use of a 5,000 international units of HCG or a GnRH agonist trigger is preferred. So if you use a GnRH agonist trigger, it should be followed by luteal phase support with LH activity. Now, oocyte maturation with or without a freeze-all strategy is preferred over coasting. Cabergoline and albumin as additional preventive measures has not been recommended, though some studies show a mild role with dopamine agonists. Now, freeze-all strategy is recommended to eliminate the risk of OHSS. A risk assessment, an individualized risk assessment for each patient is a must prior to starting stimulation. Now, I would like to conclude with this slide from Eshrey. The protocols for low responders have been a GnRH antagonist and a GnRH agonist protocol at a dose of 150 to 300 international units. In poor responders, you can use, the first line is a GnRH antagonist protocol, and the second line is a GnRH agonist protocol. Sorry, I'm talking about normal responders. In normal responders, the first line is a GnRH antagonist protocol and second line is a GnRH agonist protocol. And the recommended doses of gonadotrophins is around 150 to 225 international units. For high responders, the first and the only preferred protocol is the GnRH antagonist protocol with a gonadotrophin dose of 150 international units. A case-to-case decision should be taken to measure the endometrial thickness and the estradiol levels. So in a low responder, you can trigger with 10,000 international units HCG or 250 micrograms of recombinant HCG and supplement with progesterone, luteal phase support. In a normal responder, again 10,000 international units of HCG or 250 micrograms of recombinant HCG can be used with progesterone supplementation. In a high responder, if you're giving a GnRH antagonist protocol, you can give 200 micrograms of GnRH agonist as trigger following the freeze-all policy. But if you give a GnRH agonist in a high responder, you can maybe try a dose of 5,000 international units of HCG and a fresh ET and an adjusted luteal phase support, or go in for a cycle cancellation. So now, there are a lot of interventions for improving the success rate in poor responders, but there is an absence of an evidence for many of these interventions, especially these adjuvant therapies where there is low quality data available. So despite this, we have several of these adjuvant therapies being tried in women who have a poor ovarian response. And also, again, another drawback is that we have limited evidence regarding the gonadotrophin dosages in poor responders, and hence higher dosages are being used without evidence. So we should all try sticking on to the case-based stimulation protocols, individualizing the risk assessment and deciding the protocols on a case-to-case basis, because I don't think a uniform protocol can be applied to all. So knowing is not enough, we must apply, and wishing is not enough, we must do. I thank you all for your patient listening. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for this presentation. I mean, you have covered all the guidelines and entire data as far as the stimulation is concerned. So thank you very much. Ma'am, if you allow me, we can have a Q&A session, question and answer session. And
yes, sure.
There are already few questions in the chat box. So if you allow me, I'll read out those questions to you.
Yeah, sure.
The first question is from Dr. Vandana Shah. The question is about GnRH agonist trigger, though you have covered in your slides. But the question is, can this trigger be used in IUI cycle when the spontaneous LH surge has already been started?
She's also asked something else, right? At what size the follicle is antagonist started in an IUI cycle?
Yes, I mean, there are multiple questions, so I thought I'll go one by one.
Yeah, sure. So we've tried GnRH agonist in IUI cycles, especially when the patient is at a risk, when she has 3 or more follicles, more than 16 millimeter. We found some beneficial effect in using GnRH agonist triggers, but if you measure the LH, and if you found that the LH surge is already happening, I don't think giving a GnRH agonist is going to make a difference. And at what size of the follicle is antagonist started in an IUI? So IUI is basically a cost-effective procedure. So adding antagonist will just improve, it will just add on to the cost of the patient. So there is nothing like a fixed protocol and a flexible protocol. So at our center, we don't routinely use any antagonists for IUI unless there are problems like the patient's husband has not been able to reach the place on time or something like that. That is only indication for us to use an antagonist. Otherwise, in a routine IUI cycle, we don't use an antagonist, and we use cetrorelix routinely, but only we restrict it mainly to the ART cycles.
Yes, ma'am, thank you very much. The next question is, as far as the GnRH antagonist is concerned, which is your preferred one, cetrorelix or ganirelix?
Yeah, so we use cetrorelix at our center,
Yes.
but that is again only for IVF cycles.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions. As far as ovulation protocols are concerned, I mean, do you have any additional experiences or tips to share with the doctors?
I think that is why I didn't just want to stick on to just the guidelines from one forum alone. That's why I've incorporated all this. I think whatever protocols that I wanted to share has been mentioned in my presentation. There's nothing specific that I wanted to say again.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you very much. We'll wait a few more questions if there are any. Otherwise, then we can conclude this session. Thank you, ma'am. I don't see any more questions. So thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation, excellent data. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.